The Uber car-sharing service is fighting for legal status worldwide. Traditional taxi drivers complain of unfair competition. Uber's customers say it's often a better and cheaper ride. Can Uber be a part of the regulated transportation system? And what's next for the sharing economy? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dedi Nabugeda. Uber says it's changing the way the world moves, but the U.S. app-based ride-sharing company is controversial. It's facing legal challenges in various countries it operates in, and it epitomizes the tension between fast-moving technology and traditional industry. Well, that struggle has played out on the streets of France, where taxi drivers say Uber is threatening their livelihoods, and where the company has now suspended its controversial Uber Pop service. Traditional cab drivers are angry that Uber drivers avoid paying taxi licenses, and that's led to accusations of, quote, deceptive commercial practices. Well, it's not all bad news, though, for Uber. A Canadian judge threw out a case which tried to ban an Uber service in Toronto, saying there was no evidence that it was operating as a taxi broker. The verdict backs up one of Uber's main defenses, which Canada boss Ian Black explained by saying this: "We are pleased with today's ruling, which confirms that ride-sharing is a new business model distinct from traditional taxi services." Let's bring in our guests to talk about this. In London, Alex Wood. He's the editor-in-chief of The Memo. That's an online publication covering technology, innovation, and the changing face of business. And joining us via Skype from Reigate in the UK is Errol Balkan. He's the founder and lead designer of Indie. Thanks very much for joining us on Inside Story. So, Errol, when you look at the issue over in Canada, while licensed taxi drivers in Toronto are subject to a long list of regulations, including set fares and insurance, as well as safety requirements, the list just goes on and on. The Uber X drivers don't have to follow the same rules, and they argue that it's a technology company, not a taxi company. Do they have a valid argument?
I think they would love to have a valid argument. That is what their business relies on, that distinction. Personally, I don't think they do. I think they are trying in a way to overturn some of the labor protections that some people have fought very hard for over the last few hundred years, and trying to not be regulated in any way.
Alex?
I completely disagree, because if you look at a lot of the private minicab drivers that operate here in London, many of them do operate as contractors, and many of them choose to operate as contractors. Now, employment law differs across the world and in different jurisdictions, but I think what Uber is trying to do is to allow people who want to work in this way, where they manage their own time, they manage their own benefit system as well, and they manage their own provisions for pensions and everything else for the future. This is a way for them to do it. And I think while it may be disruptive, it's kind of part of the future, and this is something that's not going to change.
Now, in France, though, Alex, it costs more than 100,000 euros for a taxi license for a driver to get a license in Paris. And Uber drivers pay nothing. From what we understand, they just use their own cars, and they pay a proportion of what they make to the Uber company. Surely you can understand their anger when they came out on the streets and demonstrated. I'm referring to the taxi drivers and not the Uber drivers.
Absolutely, and I think many people have a lot of sympathy with the taxi drivers. But what's interesting is if you look at public opinion in France, a lot of the intelligence I've had from over in Paris is that actually public opinion is supporting Uber. If you've ever had the pleasure of visiting Paris, you will know that the taxi service is not great at best. And the fact that they have to pay around 240,000 euros to get a license, that to me says that's a market that needs disrupting, and it needs more new entrants coming in. And what Uber is doing is offering an alternative. And fundamentally, it seems like the public are demanding that service as well. So yes, the license is incredibly expensive, and Uber's drivers are not subject to that same license, but maybe we should be looking at the actual regulation framework and not at this kind of competition.
Well, let's talk about the regulation framework. Errol, how can cities regulate the Uber service, and should they be doing so?
I think they definitely should. I mean, there's a reason why certain services are licensed. There are safety issues, for example. Drivers normally receive a level of training in different cities. So Uber wants to just skip over all of that conveniently and not have to worry about it because they classify, basically the core of it is they classify their drivers as contractors and not employees. Now, if they were employees, they would have certain rights that they don't have as contractors. And one of the key issues that this comes down to is how much control does Uber actually have over how these drivers do their work. And recently in California, the California Labor Commission decided that at least one of their drivers was an employee and not a contractor based on, among other things, that clause that they have a lot of control over how they do things.
But how does a city, Errol, actually go about regulating the service? And is it a sort of one-size-fits-all model?
Maybe not, but we could start by leveling the playing field. In other words, what if we classified Uber's drivers as employees, then they would have certain rights. That's one form of regulation. We have an existing framework with which we could use as a baseline to say, okay, great, be disruptive in terms of offering a better service, but that doesn't necessarily mean you get to do everything that you want to do without any laws, without any regulation whatsoever, because there are very important concerns regarding safety, for example. That's important. We can regulate intelligently. Regulation doesn't have to be ridiculous.
Alex, how do the cities regulate?
Speaking from the experience of London, I think London actually regulates very well for private minicab drivers. Uber drivers are subject to the very same regulations that some of our largest private minicab companies operate under. They have to apply for a license from TfL. Their vehicles are also checked. That's Transport for London. And I think actually it would be wrong to try to place more regulation and more employee-like structures onto an industry, and we've seen this from the other competitors to Uber, some of which have been operating in London for 10 years, operate very well under the contractor setup, and people are happy and people want to work like that. And I really feel strongly that this is a case of regulation needs to keep up with demand in the market. If it was the case that Uber were coming in and destroying the existing market and destroying all the opportunities for black cab drivers here in London, I think it's a different story. But you only have to look on a Friday or a Saturday night, the demand for all of these taxi cab apps is going through the roof across markets around the world, because young people and professional people with these kind of apps want services like this. And let me give an example of where I think a lot of the traditional...
It sounds like what you're saying, Alex, is that there seems to be a harmonious relationship between regular taxi drivers in London as well as the Uber taxi drivers. But why is this not the case in a lot of other cities, like France, for example, like some cities in Canada, Mexico as well? The taxi drivers in Mexico are pushing the city there to regulate or even ban Uber, saying that it's unfair.
Well, I should add that there is a far from harmonious relationship between the black cab drivers, which are licensed by the city here in London, and Uber drivers. But I think it's because these guys have really failed to innovate, and I have to be critical of this. It is ridiculous that in 2015, you cannot pay for taxi journeys by credit card. Black cab drivers have systematically avoided innovation and made it as difficult as possible for consumers to do what they want. And what happens? People decide that actually opening an app and ordering a car that comes to your door is a damn sight more convenient. And it's not at all a surprise that this is what's happening in the industry.
Errol, how can regulation affect Uber itself?
Depending on the type of regulation, it could kill Uber. I mean, if it's a wrong type of regulation, of course. And I don't.
And when you say the wrong type of regulation, what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean regulation that doesn't really tackle the core issue here. By banning Uber outright, for example, instead of saying, look, okay, if you abide by certain, baseline rules that everyone has to play by, then okay, innovate on the experience, innovate on, as Alex was rightly saying, the existing institutions also have to compete on the experience that they provide, on the service that they provide. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you get to just prance into a market effectively, practice a form of new world dumping, and say that that's disruption. I mean, disruption can be ethical, but don't forget that viruses also disrupt, and it's not always good for the organism.
And Errol, you mentioned a little earlier on that there are issues as well of safety and sort of reliability and liability, when it comes to Uber. Talk to us a little bit about that. Can you expand?
Well, I mean, for example, in France, recently, as you know, 2 Uber executives were arrested for essentially, what was stated as allegedly running an illegal taxi service. And part of it was their Uber Pop service didn't require any sort of licensing of their drivers. Now, normally, drivers have to have licenses, and with that comes a level of accountability. The company itself, if they're employees, is liable for any accidents, etc., that occur. I mean, Uber's used this in the past to sidestep a lot of things, including discrimination, saying, look, our drivers can discriminate if they want to, essentially, based on on disabilities, for example, not allowing people with wheelchairs into their cars because they're not our employees, and that doesn't concern us. So I think what people are really saying is, there's a base level of responsibility that you're going to have to take if you are operating in this space or in any space. Really, I think this should be a bare minimum for companies to say you have to be responsible in what you do, not just perpetuate this, libertarian notion of all regulation is horrible, we'll do whatever we want, and the market will decide. That's not always in the best interests of people.
Well, gentlemen, Uber is just one of a number of companies which has evolved out of what's called the sharing economy. It's commonly used to describe services which allow owners to sell their unused resources. A whole range of companies offer these services now, allowing people to rent out their houses, cars, and even household appliances. Supporters saying that's just one part of it. Well, the sharing economy also includes systems which, for example, allow used goods to be swapped or even to help each other with different skills. Alex, what are the possibilities of the sharing economy? How far could this concept actually take us?
I think the sharing economy is something that is so exciting, and it's potentially the start of an entirely new economy for many countries around the world. It's this idea that you no longer have to own things. I mean, one example that I think many people are very comfortable with is the idea of those car sharing clubs where there's a car out on the street, and whenever you want to use that car, you just tap a card on the windscreen and off you go. You don't have to worry about any of the burdens of ownership anymore. And what we're seeing with Uber, and I think also more recently Airbnb, the American service that allows you to rent out your home for people to stay as guests, is a complete shake-up of the market. And what's really exciting about the sharing economy is it's lowering costs for people. But as we've just been discussing about Uber, it is causing so many problems with regulation because I think governments and policy have failed to keep up.
Errol, this idea of paying, why should you pay a lot for something when you can actually pay much cheaper and rent it from someone? Do you agree?
Well, one thing that Alex said stuck out. He said, you won't have to own anything anymore, that people won't own anything anymore. And I was recently giving a talk at a conference in Paris called WeShare, where I heard this over and over again, that, ownership is over and we'll all just be renting. But of course, if we actually examine this statement, the question arises, well, who are we renting from? And the answer is increasingly a small portion of society who will be the owners. There will be ownership, only it'll be a much smaller portion of society that owns. Everyone else will rent. So what the sharing economy, in the sense of how it's implemented by Uber or Airbnb, what that doesn't do is it doesn't alter the fundamental power relationships. These platforms, Airbnb, Uber, etc., are monopolies. There are network effects that they take advantage of, and there is lock-in within these platforms. So, for example, if I'm an Uber driver, I have my reputation on Uber. I can't, when I stop working for Uber and work for someone else, take that reputation along with me. There's lock-in on these platforms. So I think it's not that people won't have there won't be ownership anymore. No, just as we're seeing happening in the traditional economy, a very small group will own, everyone else will rent. So I think the rental economy is probably a better word for sharing economy as implemented by Uber and Airbnb. It can be implemented differently.
When you say differently, what do you mean by that, Errol? And also, how can traditional companies compete in this marketplace? Let me just give you some figures, because PricewaterhouseCoopers is forecasting that total revenues for the 5 largest sharing economy businesses, it's saying, could be about £9 billion in the UK by the year 2025 and $335 billion this time globally. So this just seems to be the way forward.
Well, it can be implemented differently in how it's designed. These systems are designed just like our mainstream technology is designed today, which is to say they're centralized. So in terms of ownership and control, Uber Incorporated owns and controls the Uber platform. And then, people use that platform both to offer their services and to take advantage of those services. It could be designed in a decentralized manner. There's nothing technically infeasible about that. So in a peer-to-peer fashion, and there are alternatives that are coming up that are peer-to-peer. People are exploring this notion of how do we actually make it possible for people to share without a broker in the middle. Because really, that's what Uber and Airbnb are. They're the man in the middle. And we can design it so that we don't have a man in the middle. And that's a very different architecture for technology in general. That's a much more democratic architecture for technology.
Alex, a moment ago, you seemed to be very optimistic about the way forward when it comes to sharing economy. But what issues, in your opinion, could stand in the way? Because words like insurance and legal liability are being thrown around.
Absolutely, and I would like to point out that I think this is a very early stage sector, and so that it's not without problems. And I think a lot of the things that Errol has pointed out, I completely agree with. Insurance and accountability are a problem in this sector. But for me, I think the really exciting thing is I look at how many young people in particular are demanding these kind of services. One of my associate editors lives between Paris and Berlin, and a company like Airbnb facilitates that lifestyle for him. He's not ready to own a property, and I think if they are offering this kind of lifestyle to people and people are demanding it, that can only be a good thing. We've obviously seen some bad examples, particularly with Airbnb, of properties being trashed and certain people effectively using their Airbnb property as a rental throughout the year, therefore not paying the right taxes. But this is kind of an early stage, almost Wild West type market that is needing regulation, but I think the direction is going in the right way.
How do you see it evolving, Alex?
I think it's, I have to say again, London is a good example of this, where the London government has been working actually really closely with Airbnb to find some common ground and some agreement that actually you're allowed to rent out your property for X number of months in the year and you don't have to pay extra taxes. But it's about having that clear line, allowing people to understand what is and isn't okay. In other cities, Airbnb is subject to a hotel tax just like any other hotel would be, because those cities define it as a service just like a hotel. And I think we will start to see things slowly changing, but it really requires a dialogue between these companies and not the kind of scenes that we've seen in Paris, where we're seeing people
Alex,
throwing rocks at people.
Right, and speaking of taxes, you bring up a good point, because there is the point of view that Airbnb is allowing people, in fact, to evade taxes and regulations.
Absolutely, I don't disagree with that in principle. Airbnb's argument would be that it has enabled a lot of people. Interestingly, a lot of people throughout the economic crisis in London have turned to Airbnb to rent out an extra room and actually bring in some extra income so that they can make up the difference on their bills. But as you point out, there is a tax issue there. But I think, again, this was a service that didn't exist over 5 years ago, and we now need to catch up in terms of frameworks and make sure that everyone is paying the right kind of tax due.
So when the Centre, Errol, I'll come over to you in just a moment, but Alex, when the Centre for Economic and Policy Research writes that the sharing economy is the latest fashion craze among business writers, but in their exuberance over the next big thing, many boosters have overlooked the reality that this new business model is largely based on evading regulations and breaking the law as well. This is something you do not agree with.
I understand that point of view, and I think you can take isolated cases out of some of the bigger names like Uber and Airbnb, but I think as a whole, the sharing economy has a huge amount of promise. There's a great service in France called BlaBlaCar that's now spread across Europe that allows people to share car journeys. So let's say I'm going to a music festival, someone else is going to a music festival. It makes sense that you can come together and share that ride and reduce the pollution and reduce the cost of getting there. There's lots of good stories behind the sharing economy, and I think it's important not to kind of tarnish the whole sector with some of the unfortunate incidents that have happened with some of the bigger companies. I am unashamedly optimistic about the potential for this sector.
Errol, one figure values Uber at $17 billion, and some are even suggesting it'll be the next $100 billion company. Clearly, Uber's system is working.
Yes, definitely. Of course it is. Monopolies work for a reason. I mean, when you look at how Uber was set up, it was set up with a huge amount of venture capital that allowed them to get to where they are and reap the network effects of being first to this market and of creating it in a way. I mean, we talk about the Uber of this and the Uber of that. And again, if going forward, they are intelligently regulated, if going forward we can, in a way, negate some of the monopoly effects that they have. So they have lock-in, for example. We could use interoperability. We could regulate to say, okay, Uber, that's great. You have a rating system, but you need to be able to make it so that drivers can export that and take it with them if they're going to go work for Lyft. And Lyft, you have to do the same thing. So there are things we can do to negate some of the monopolistic aspects of these businesses. And again,
how
there
much
are
will is
alternatives.
there to go down that path, though, Errol?
Well, see, that's the problem. And this is a general problem as well that we have in Europe, that we have at the state levels, we have in the US. There is a lot of institutional corruption. And I don't mean old school corruption as in here's some money under the table. I mean institutional corruption as in an influence of money. So the influence of corporate finance and public decision making. And that's affecting a lot of the regulation or the lack of regulation that we're getting. So that's one of the main challenges in general for fighting monopoly today. We really need to remove that corporate finance, the influence of corporate finance in public decision making. That's a much harder challenge.
That is the question I was going to ask you. How hard is it going to be to do that?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, we're talking about whether or not we want to live in a new sort of corporate feudalism or whether we quite enjoy democracy and would like to see more of that. You know, it's a very hard question. It's a very hard issue to tackle, but one that we have to tackle. And to do that, we need to strengthen our democratic institutions. And we're seeing a very interesting referendum take place today in Greece, which I think will have far greater implications and affect these issues also, because the referendum and the vote we're seeing there is in essence about the clash of corporate interests and democratic interests.
Right. Alex, just a final word for you and whether there is the political will to regulate industry.
I absolutely do believe that there is the political will. Here in the UK, we just had the launch of a new sharing economy body that exists as a non-governmental organisation but is very much looking at policy, bringing together some of the leading companies here and debating with government. And I think the only way that we can see positive change in this industry is by having proper dialogue and not seeing the kind of scenes that we've seen in France. I mean, one closing remark I think we should share is that over in France there's been a lot of people actually putting out this message. It's a bit of a joke, but saying that I just got beaten up by a group of postmen for sending an email at work. And that's the kind of thing that we're seeing in France, is this idea that let's not deal with innovation, let's not try and move things forward, let's just pelt people with rocks. And that's what we've seen. I think that's not a healthy model. I think we need to see debate, we need to see dialogue.
All right, well, we're very glad you joined us on this debate. Thank you very much, Alex Wood, for joining us from London over in Reigate. Errol Balkan, thank you as well. And thank you for watching Inside Story. As always, we welcome your thoughts. You can get in touch via our program page at aljazeera.com. You can also post your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can even tweet us using @AJ Inside Story. From me and the whole team here in Doha, bye-bye for now.